Here's Ed Bernstein.
Hey, the state of the world got you down a little bit? Maybe a little humor will help. And here to talk about it is Andrew Tarvin.
Hello.
Humor engineer.
That's
Love
right.
the title. What does that mean?
Humor engineer, yeah, it's a great made-up title, but it's the kind of combinations of my background. So humor engineer means that I help organizations and people solve challenges using things like humor in the workplace.
Right, and the engineer part is because you kind of have an engineering background, right?
Yeah.
Technology.
Absolutely. So yeah, I feel like I was born an engineer because I've always been obsessed with efficiency to the point that I was born 3 weeks early. So apparently even in the womb, I was like, I don't need a full 9 months. I'm ready to go right now.
Right.
And so always engineering minded, and then went to the Ohio State University, got a degree in computer science and engineering, and started working with computers kind of right away.
So were you? Did you have a sense of humor in those days?
Not really. Like I started doing improv and stand-up in college, and even afterwards, and then I went to my high school reunion a few years after that, and people found out that I did comedy, and they're like, but you're not funny. Because I was never the class clown or the life of the party person. I was very much the academic. My senior year, I was voted teacher's pet. And I'm very much an introvert. If you know your personality assessments, I'm a type A, blue square, conscientious INTJ with the sign of Aquarius, which means that I am a stubborn, ambitious introvert who likes long walks on the beach by myself.
So does that make the argument that anybody can develop a sense of humor?
I think so. I think humor is like cooking or like learning a language or playing the piano. It is something that I think anyone can learn to get better at. So what we talk about in our programs is that we can help anyone learn to be funnier, not necessarily across the board funny, right? If we work together, that's not like you're magically going to get a show here on the Strip right away and sell out to all the audiences and things. But we can take you from wherever you are right now to a little bit higher by learning some of the tricks and the trades that comedians use to make people laugh.
For example, enlighten me with one trick.
Yeah, so one very tactical trick is a structural thing, and it's called a comic triple. So a comic triple is this idea where when you're sharing a list of 3 things, the third thing is something comedic. So for example, I joke that, as a kid I used to like to take things apart and put them back together. Right. Things like clocks and radios and my parents' marriage, right? And so that parents' marriage is a comic triple. It's something unexpected because the first 2 get you an expectation this way.
Right. The
third thing changes that expectation and it creates laughter.
So somebody determined that 3 was the good number for that. I mean, if you do 4, it's not as funny?
Yeah, 4 isn't quite as funny, and I think we have the rule of 3 in general. There's something about humans that we love closure with 3, but part of it is that 3, and this is the engineering side of me coming out of like, how do we parse this? 3 is the minimum number you can have to create a pattern or confirm a pattern. Because the first thing just exists, the second thing suggests that maybe there's a pattern, and then the third time you hear it, it says, okay, this is in fact a pattern. The fact that we know that through human kind of life expanse of like this 3 is a pattern, by using a comic triple, we're now breaking that expectation, which is part of the setup and punchline of a joke, and that's what makes people laugh.
Right. I mean, you're a self-proclaimed nerd, right?
Absolutely.
So is nerd humor different than other types of humor?
I think just the subject or the persona is a little bit different. So like when I do stand-up comedy, a lot of it is about an engineer's take on the world, right? So I joke that, as an engineer, emotions are just data, right? Which I have learned is the wrong thing to say when someone is crying. Right, so that's a joke. That's like, okay, here's a nerd's perspective on that, or what's a nerd's perspective on dating or on love. So I talk about quarterly love units review and how you quantify love and things. So it just changes what the persona is, but that's the starting point for anyone to become a comedian is understanding what their sense of humor is. How do they see the world, and what makes them go, that's kind of interesting.
I notice oftentimes I go to a funeral and people be doing eulogies.
Yep.
And and it seems like the audience gets driven from, crying and sorrow to laughter,
Yeah.
right? I mean, how does that work? And how is it appropriate to use humor in funerals?
I mean, I think so. So humor is just one tool that we have. So like in the workplace and things like that, it doesn't mean that humor is always going to be appropriate, but I think it often can be in serious situations. And a lot of times, like with funerals, it's about changing their perspective. Sometimes people are like, a funeral should be about mourning the loss of someone. But a lot of people feel like a funeral should be the celebration of someone's life. And someone's life is going to be full of humor. And so the humor, I think, is appropriate because it's funny stories. And also one of the things that humor is really effective at doing is relieving tension. Right? You have all this tension and all this built up emotion at a funeral, or from the stress of day-to-day life, or from watching the news and not agreeing with what's going on. Humor can relieve that tension. And that's one of the great benefits as an engineer, why I like humor so much, is because it can be effective for specific goals, one of which being relieving stress.
Yeah, oftentimes people can get in trouble for trying to be funny at the wrong time or in the wrong place.
Yeah.
Workplace is a very, very difficult line to walk when it comes to humor, right?
Yeah, and so what we say is, I don't know anyone who's ever been fired because of a bad joke, but I do know people who have been fired because of an inappropriate joke, right? And so a bad joke is, I love bad jokes, I love puns and things, and so a bad joke would be, I once had to miss class because of hypothermia. I was too cool for school.
Okay.
Right? That's a bad joke.
Right.
You're not going to get fired because of a joke like that, but you are going to get fired because of an inappropriate joke. And an inappropriate joke is typically inappropriate for one of three reasons. One, it has an inappropriate topic, right? So using humor in the workplace or with certain people is not an excuse to talk about things that you wouldn't normally talk about otherwise. Second would be that it's an inappropriate target. So sometimes humor has a target. So you might poke fun at yourself with self-defeating humor, or you might poke fun of someone, like making fun of someone else. Like George Carlin was very good at this. And that can be inappropriate in the workplace depending on who that target is. And then finally, it can come at an inappropriate time, right? Like if you've just fired someone, it's not the time to bust out a Frozen parody music of like, gotta let you go, right? It's more about, okay, not appropriate time there, maybe wait a little bit later before using that humor.
Yeah, and of course I should mention that you wrote a book, Humor That Works, The Missing Skill for Success and Happiness at Work by Andrew Tarvin, available, I guess, at Amazon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Since we don't have many more bookstores available. I was listening, actually last night, this morning, to public radio, and Conan was on, Conan O'Brien was on. And you mentioned, making fun of yourself. He was saying that, he often does that, but there's a fine line in doing that also, because if you go too far in doing it, it's not funny anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. So self-defeating humor, there's four styles of humor as defined by psychologist Rod A. Martin. The first style is affiliative humor. That's positive, inclusive humor. That's kind of like a happy hour or doing kind of a fun activity together. There's self-enhancing humor, and that's a way of using humor to make a situation more positive, right? It's kind of like the idea of like, oh, I have to go through this commute anyway, so I'm going to listen to, a comedy podcast, or I'm going to listen to Conan or something like that, and make that process a little bit more fun. And then there's self-defeating humor, which is a negative form of humor, and the target is yourself. And so it can be great when used sparingly and when in a high status position, right? If you are the leader of an organization or a group, you use self-defeating humor, poke fun at yourself so that people are like, oh, this person doesn't take themselves too seriously. So like when I'm speaking, that's kind of a status position for whatever reason. So when I'm speaking, I'll make jokes about like my stature, like I'm a frail person, right? I was born 8.3 pounds and then stayed that way till I was 15 years old. Right, so I make fun of jokes about that, and it makes people laugh, and it's like, okay, doesn't take himself too seriously. But if you do that too much, then people start to worry, or they're like, okay, does this person have self-esteem issues, or is this a pity party, or right, exactly what Conan was saying. If you can go too far with it, where it's no longer funny, and now more of a like, is this maybe a cry for help? And so, like anything, humor. What I like to say is like humor is like the salt of a meal. Right? Like humor doesn't replace the work that you have to do. It's like something that you sprinkle in, you use sparingly as a way to make something taste a little bit better.
Good analogy. When you're speaking in public, is it most people try to get a joke in the very beginning, right? To kind of try to relate to the audience. Is that a good thing?
I think so. So I'm in context. So sometimes people hear this advice like, oh, start with a joke. And so someone goes online, they look up online a joke, they tell a joke, it's only kind of funny, it has no relationship whatsoever to the topic that they're going to talk about, and the remaining 59 minutes and 30 seconds of what they're doing is terribly boring. That's not effective humor. Instead, if you start with a story, and if that story or that joke has some type of connection to the material that you're going to use later, then it sets up the day.
Or the audience.
Or the audience, or that the audience will like. So for example, I've had the good fortune to do a TEDx talk, and in the TEDx talk I start with the story about my grandmother texting me. And at first it's kind of like, okay, it's a funny story, what does it have to do with anything? And the big punchline to it is my grandmother's misunderstanding of the acronym WTF.
Okay.
Because
she thought it was what?
Yeah, she thought it was, wow, that's fun. And she texted me that. And so that sets up the entire day, the entire talk for me to say, you know what, actually I think the world would be a slightly better place if more people thought WTF like my grandmother, if they thought, wow, that's fun. And so what we're going to talk about today is how we can say, look at our work a little bit more and say, how can we make it more fun?
Right. And how would you go about teaching somebody to be? Look, I'm a relatively serious guy. Okay, I mean, I don't consider myself, having a good sense of humor as far as joke telling. I mean, I can appreciate jokes, but I can't really tell them well. Some people have a natural ability for telling jokes. Maybe is it a timing thing?
I think it's partially a timing thing, and I don't know. I'm always kind of a little bit apprehensive to use the word natural. Because I don't think it's in our DNA whether or not we're funny. I think it's something that we maybe grow up with because of people that we're around, but it's my belief that anyone can kind of learn it. And so the idea of teaching humor, one of the things I think that's important to start with is understanding that humor is more broad than comedy. So like when we hear humor, a lot of times we think stand-up comedy, punchliners, one-liners, things like that, but it's actually more broad than that. It's a comic, absurd, or incongruous quality. So when we laugh, especially day to day, it's less often, like watching some of your previous interviews, you make people laugh, and it's not because you have this great setup and punchline, but because there's situational humor, or there's social humor, or there's conversational humor. We were talking a little bit earlier before we started this about Seinfeld and how that show, there's certainly setups and punchlines in it, but it's also just jokes about the human experience. There's comments that make us laugh in that way. And that's, I think, a great starting point for people is recognizing they don't have to be great joke tellers, but instead it's more about observations around the world. So that's a starting point for learning humor.
Good. I'm going to talk about how you can teach leaders to be better leaders through humor. But we'll be right back after this word. My daughter Dana fought a long battle with Crohn's disease before passing last year. Max has spent a lifetime scoring goals.
It's our goal to help the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation find a cure for this horrible disease, so no one else's child has to suffer like Dana did.
Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis may be unfamiliar to you, but there are currently over 3 million Americans suffering from both. Join Max and I in scoring our goal to find a cure. Hi, we're back with humor engineer Andrew Tarvin, who wrote the book, Humor That Works, The Missing Skill for Success and Happiness at Work.
Yeah.
And we were going to talk about how we can, secure better leaders through humor.
Yeah, I think that there's a tremendous amount that leaders can learn from stand-up comedians about how to be better presenters, how to be stronger communicators, because comedians are very, very good at capturing people's attention and keeping their attention. In fact, Seinfeld says that there's really no such thing as an attention span, only boring content, right? And so leaders, one, can learn if they can effectively use humor, they're going to keep people engaged and paying attention. I think another thing that they can learn is the importance of starting off strong. So if you're a stand-up comedian, you've got 30, probably only about 15 seconds to prove to the audience that you're worth listening to.
As soon as you walk up on stage, people are making judgments about you, correct?
Exactly. Same thing with leadership. As soon as you start to kind of appear in front of people, they're making snap judgments about, is this someone that I'm going to follow or not? And so leaders can learn from comedians the importance of getting people kind of on board right away. In comedy, that's starting immediately with a joke. In leadership, it's starting with head nodding, what they call head nodding, where you start with some, hey, let's talk about some things that we both agree with, right? If I'm trying to convince you to buy something, then I want to get you to agree that, hey, you have this challenge, don't you? And it's a tough challenge, right? And because of that challenge, this stuff exists. And you're nodding the whole time. And then by the time I get to, well, we happen to have a solution for you, you're already nodding and more likely to say, okay, yeah, I'll take that.
Right.
So we can learn that. We can
Great for sales also, right?
Oh, absolutely great. Because sales is basically leadership, right? It's influencing people towards hopefully a positive common goal. So that's just one thing. Another thing that you can learn from comedians is the importance of giving credit, right? So then one of the cardinal sins in comedy is stealing people's material. And as a leader, sometimes people are like, oh, I'm going to take credit for what my people do. But that's so weird to me, because as a leader, your job is to get the best out of the people who report to you. So if you take their credit, you're discounting your own ability to get the best out of other people. So that's another thing that they can like, oh yeah, I should be giving proper credit. I should be lifting other people up, because they're only going to lift me up as well.
You know, oftentimes you start talking about communication. It's very difficult to communicate on fragile issues with people oftentimes, whether it's a family member, an employee, spouse, somebody in a relationship with. How do you use humor to diffuse a difficult situation?
It's a great question. I think there's a couple of ways. One, I think prior to ever a difficult situation coming up, the stronger relationship you have with someone, the better it is going to be able to solve that problem. So partially you use humor to just build rapport with someone over time, so that when that tension comes up, you can relieve it a little bit. When the actual tension or moment happens, one of the things that is great is observational humor, because what that does is it interrupts things. Because so often tension is about, you kind of get so into something and it becomes less about solving a problem, more about how do I beat you? How do I win so that I'm the victor and you're the one that loses? And we forget that it's about solving a problem instead. So humor can be a great interrupt to that. So I have an example. So I used to work at Procter & Gamble before I started this. And I remember being in a meeting, and we were getting very, very tense. We were behind schedule. People were starting to argue. And my manager had to take a step back, and he's like, all right, listen, at the end of the day, we have to remember that we sell soap. And it made all of us in the room kind of laugh, because we were fighting as if we were actually going to war over something. And it was just a pattern interrupt to be like, oh wait, no, this isn't as serious as we thought maybe. And that's not to discount what we're doing, but it was just a moment for us to take a break. And that's another thing humor can do, is it can relieve the tension. We can laugh a little bit, so we can intentionally be like, all right, listen, this is getting pretty intense between you and I. I need 10 minutes to myself. And then you go for a walk, maybe you watch a YouTube comedy video. Because that's one of the other things, is to effectively use humor in the workplace, you don't always have to be the creator of the humor. You can be a curator of it. So if you don't feel like you're good at telling jokes or telling stories, instead you can be like, okay, well, I can watch this funny YouTube video as a way to relieve my own stress. Or I can send this TEDx talk or this podcast to my team that has the message that I'm trying to get across. You do that for tension, you relieve that stress, and then you come back a little bit more re-engaged and back to the idea of how do we solve this problem, as opposed to how do I beat you in my argument.
How has humor changed because of technology? I mean, you ventured into both fields, right? I mean, it's got to be different today than it was 20 years ago.
It is. I mean, it's certainly a lot more accessible, right? It used to be that a comedian could write an hour-long special, and they would do that for years, over and over and over again, just traveling around, because there was no recording of it. Now you record an hour-long special that goes on a Netflix or HBO or Comedy Central, and you have to do new material because people have seen the video version of it. Now they want to see something live. They want to see something different when they go and see you live.
Makes it more difficult to be?
In some ways, right? But in other ways, it makes it easier. One of the greatest tips, so anyone who's kind of interested in learning to use humor, one of the starting tips that I recommend is keeping a humor notebook. This is keeping an observation, like anytime something makes you laugh, or a funny story happens to you, or something just makes you go, huh, why is that the case? That's kind of interesting. You write it down in a notebook. And technology has made that easier, because it used to be comedians were carrying around paper notebooks. Now we have our phones, and we can use Evernote or the Notes app on our iPhone, and we capture those ideas. And then when we sit down later, when we're like, okay, I want to be funny, I want to work on a story, or I'm giving a presentation, I want to incorporate something, rather than starting from scratch and be like, okay, be funny, which is hard to do, you're like, oh, I had this observation before. This is kind of an interesting idea. Like I observed not too long ago, like, I don't like mint chocolate. Right? I don't know if you like mint chocolate.
Love it.
Really? See, I don't like mint chocolate.
Mint chocolate chip.
Yeah, so I was like,
The best
okay, let
ice
me
cream.
explore
Yeah.
that. That's an interesting observation.
Okay.
So many people like it, but I don't. And so my justification became, I don't like mint chocolate because I've never been eating chocolate, and been like, you know what would go great with this?
Yeah.
Toothpaste. Right? That's what I associate. So it starts with an observation,
Yeah.
and then you build off of it. And so technology has helped some of those steps along the way, for sure.
And then and it must take you a certain number of times to fine-tune that joke.
Yeah, and that's kind of the step 2. So, right, we start with a sense of humor, and the having a humor notebook is a great way to start to
Right.
build out your sense of humor. The second step to like the skill of humor is your ability to turn it into content. That's content and delivery. And the key there is getting on stage, right? So for comedians, this is why, even when Dave Chappelle is doing a new special or Ellen DeGeneres is doing a new special, they constantly get on stage because they have to test stuff. And for comedians, it's actual stage. For everyone, Shakespeare said the world is your stage, right? So we can just use humor in everyday life, and you can use it in conversation, and did that make people laugh? Or on Twitter, I like to post jokes that I'm like, okay, I want to see if this is kind of funny and see what people's reactions are. See if people like it or not. And that's another way to test it to, like you said, refine it and build it over time.
But when you're doing it on Twitter, it's written, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, so it's a whole different feeling when you're receiving a commentary on Twitter than hearing somebody reciting it in person.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And there's no guarantee that what works on Twitter is going to work on stage, or even, this is a weird kind of interesting thing about comedy. There's no guarantee that what worked in front of one audience live will work in front of the next audience live. And that's partially learning about who your audience is, and also just getting comfortable with, constant reps. It's like any skill. Right? When you're first learning to drive, or when you're first learning a language, or when you're first learning to walk, it came from practice and repetition. And humor is the same way. You're not going to be able to take one course and magically become, a master pianist. Same way you're not going to take one course and become a master humorist, but you're starting to build that skills, and now it becomes, how do you practice it?
Right. I recall after 9/11, there was a lot of conversation on when it would be appropriate to make fun of something again.
Yeah.
And there is a period of time after a tragedy that humor is or is not appropriate, I would think.
Yeah, and especially the subject matter. But I thought, particularly with 9/11, I thought the Onion News, the satire site, did a fantastic job with that, because their humor then was about not about the tragedy of the situation, but more the things around it. So one of their, fake headlines was, God angrily clarifies "Thou shalt not kill" rule. Right? And it's kind of like, again, not necessarily the funniest thing, but it is something that allows us to relieve that stress. Humor has become this adaptation that we as humans use as a way to relieve stress. It's a cathartic experience, because if we didn't have it, right, this is why I think it was Gandhi said that, without a sense of humor, I long ago would have died, right? Because of all the stresses of these things, humor is our way to manage the challenges of the human experience.
Yeah. Humor in the workplace, I mean, you kind of specialize in that, and that's the most difficult environment to be funny. But, like for instance, if let's say you had a coworker and, and they keep borrowing your staple gun or something and not returning it, how would you deal with a situation like that with humor?
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways, right? Someone's taken something and they haven't given it back despite you repeatedly doing it. So you might use humor, and you might create a missing flyer, like the old school, like Wild West of like missing stapler, and like post it up at their cubicle.
Like the missing child?
Yeah, exactly. Like a missing child, create a like fake, milk carton, because that's just something that's going to be different that kind of grabs their attention. Or you might, go up to them and kind of give them an over-the-top like, I'm missing this thing. Pretend it's like a person or a missed loved one, right? Like I've just so desperately needed this stapler, and it hasn't been there in my time of need. But if you could, find it, like be a little bit over the top with it is another example. And just kind of just joking, building, again, going back to building the relationship with humor before is a great way to then influence people. And as an engineer, I recognize, right, as I talked about at the beginning, I'm obsessed with efficiency. But what I've learned is that you can't be efficient with humans, right? Because humans have emotions and feelings. And Instead, you have to be effective. And so humor isn't always the most efficient thing in the workplace. It does take a little bit more time to add a story to a presentation or to smile and ask someone how their day is. But it is long-term more effective. And that's the whole focus, is how do we get better results and have a little bit more fun by using humor.
Who are some of the great comedians that you're watching today?
So I'm a huge fan of George Carlin. His wordplay and his structure was, I think,
unbelievably
fantastic.
long gone, right?
Yeah, long gone, but
Yeah.
able to make you watch. So still watching some of the classics.
Yeah.
I do think that Dave Chappelle is doing some very interesting things with his Netflix comedy specials and how he's talking about things. A big fan of Hannah Gadsby. She had a special on Netflix called Nanette that got very big, and she's really talking about blurring the line of what people say is traditional stand-up comedy and building more and more of a message into it. And just recently saw her live, and her next special is also going to be great. So I think she's fantastic. I've always been a huge fan of Ellen. Just her positivity and her joke structure. Her recent special is also very good. Those are the kind of the main ones. Eddie Izzard's one of my favorite comedians. He's a fantastic storyteller. He's one of the concepts within comedy that can help you write is this idea that is, if this is true, what else is true? So if you take a simple observation, right? So an example of Eddie Izzard, he has a great bit called Death Star Canteen. And his observation is if you have the Death Star in Star Wars, right, then it's true that people live on that Death Star. And if it's true that people live on the Death Star, then it's probably true that they have to eat. And if they have to eat, then it's probably true that there's a cafeteria on the Death Star. And if it's true that there's a cafeteria on the Death Star, then it is possible that Darth Vader has gone to this cafeteria. And so he does this entire bit of Darth Vader in the cafeteria, and it kind of follows this. In a weird way, you see the logic of if this is true, what else is true. It's just very, very funny.
The name of the book is Humor That Works, Missing Skill for Success and Happiness at Work, Andrew Tarvin. It's been fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last thing that I would say just very quickly is if people are thinking about this and they're like, I'm an engineer, so I think next steps. If they're like, what do I do differently from watching this? The one thing that we encourage, certainly you can get the book and all that kind of stuff, but just start simply thinking 1 smile per hour.
Right.
Think, what is one thing that you can do each hour of the day that brings a smile to your face or the face of someone else? And that helps you to start to develop that humor habit, maybe create that humor notebook, and that'll get you starting to be a little bit funnier.
Yeah, I'm going to try that humor notebook.
Yeah.
It's a good idea just to write down jokes, because you never know when you can use one, right?
Exactly, yeah. And by
you can recycle them, right?
Oh, for sure you can.
Okay. Hey, yeah, don't miss the book, Humor That Works. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Absolutely, thank you.
My daughter Dana fought a long battle with Crohn's disease before passing last year. Max has spent a lifetime scoring goals.
It's our goal to help the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation find a cure for this horrible disease, so no one else's child has to suffer like Dana did.
Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis may be unfamiliar to you, but there are currently over 3 million Americans suffering from both. Join Max and I in scoring our goal to find a cure.